All right, I got 1:30. So welcome back, everybody. We're going to have Jose is going to give us education on Epicor Rest services. Take it
Thank
away,
you, my
Jose.
pleasure. Now I gotta click the right button again. Let's see. Is that the right screen?
It's the right screen.
Epicor Rest, your PowerPoint.
All right, cool. So I am Jose Gomez. I work for Stephen Gould Corporation as a senior software engineer. I have been doing Epicor for longer than I care to admit. And so I got really involved with this whole REST thing when it first came out. Bart Elia, former Epicor architect guy that we met at Insights, reached out and was like, hey, we're thinking about going with REST. And so I got involved in the project from the beginning and was able to do a whole bunch of testing for them. So I've really enjoyed the process, and I find the REST interface to be incredibly useful. That's pretty much all we do these days. And that's the future of Epicor too. Safe harbor, yada, yada. But as I understand it, the standard business objects are going to be going the way of the dodo, and they're going to give way to RESTful objects only. So that probably won't be for a while, I imagine, but that's kind of where the industry is headed. So it is good to get to know these things, get familiar with them, use them. They're very, very easy to use. They're very nice. So let's start at the beginning, since Fred said there was no experience needed. So I'm gonna go start at the beginning. I wanna go through it. If I'm going too fast or too slow, feel free to speed me up or slow me down. I'm assuming you don't have much knowledge of this stuff. Maybe some of you do, maybe some of you don't, but that's where we're going with it.
Jose, for the real basic person, what is it?
Yep, exactly. So what is REST, right? So REST is basically a way to interface with your Epicor data any way you want to, using the standard web services, the standard web verbs specifically, right? So as we know, the web has kind of won the race for what a computer really is, right? Most of us spend 99% of our day in a web browser, right? If we're in the computer. Epicor aside, and even that is where we're going with Kinetic 21. So the web has won that race, right? Everything is a web app. Even your phone apps are web apps. And so basically, we needed a way to be able to get data in and out of a system, call it Epicor, call it SAP, call it whatever you want, by using the web, right? And that's where REST came from. I believe in the year 2000 or so, it was first proposed. And all it is a way to send data in and out of whatever system you want using the standard web verbs. And when I talk about the standard web verbs, I'm talking about the things that happen when you visit a website, right? So when you visit a website, say when you go to google.com and you hit enter, you type it on your browser and you hit enter. What really happens is that your browser makes what's called a GET request using the GET verb onto a Google server, right? Google server gets that request and says, they want a GET. They want to retrieve something. And so it gathers up all the materials that make up the website of Google, and it sends that back to the browser, right? That's a GET request. And that is the most common request that happens when you are browsing the web. Usually, you go to Google, you use a GET request. You go to Facebook, you use a GET request. But there are several other verbs that are less used that can be used to do additional things. For example, there is the POST verb, P-O-S-T. And that happens when you're trying to generally create or submit something. So again, you go to google.com, that action of going to google.com specifically says, hey, get me what google.com looks like. And like I said, Google gathers up the images and the HTML content and sends that back to the browser. But when you get to google.com, there's a nifty little search bar. And in that search bar, you type in some stuff, blah, 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 how do you use rest.com, whatever you want. And you hit the find it or the search button. When you hit the search button, the browser once again makes a request to the Google server. But this time, instead of making a request for a GET, using a GET verb, it uses a POST verb. And that just lets the browser know that, hey, not only am I getting something back, but I'm actually sending you some data that you need to process. And that's where the POST request comes in. And now when you're browsing around in the web, you're really going to use only get and post. Most of the other ones are not really used for standard web browsing. So you go to Google, you go to Yahoo, you go to Facebook, you go to whatever the kids are into these days, you're going to be using get to retrieve information. And then when you fill out a form and hit a button, you're going to be using post. But in reality, there is a slew of verbs you can use, including put, patch, delete, and quite a few more. And so those additional verbs are actually used with the REST, the representational state transfer interfaces. And so what that does is it basically gives you a way to generate what in the industry is known as CRUD for transactions. And by CRUD, I mean create, retrieve, update, and delete, right? If you have any database of any kind, and you want to maintain that via any application, you need to be able to do basically those 5 operations. You need to be able to create records, you need to be able to retrieve records, you need to be able to update records, and you need to be able to delete those records. So that's 4 things that you need to be able to do with any database. And talk about Epicor, talk about whatever you want, but that's pretty much the gist of any application in the world, right? If you want to look up an invoice, that's a retrieve information that's done via a get. If you want to create an invoice, again, that's going to be a create, right? A post. That's going to be a create verb, and it's going to go to the post. And then you have put and patch, which is updates, and then delete is a removal. And so basically what REST does for us is it standardizes the way in which we can talk or communicate with Epicor. And that means that we can talk to Epicor from anywhere we want. We can talk to Epicor from our web browser. We can talk to Epicor from our mobile application. We can talk to Epicor from our toaster. If it's got the ability to make a simple TCP call, we can talk to Epicor that way. I've actually done some demos on where you can get your Amazon smart speaker device to retrieve data out of Epicor using REST. You can have Siri using Siri shortcuts in your iPhone, retrieve data out of Epicor pretty trivially, and it's all because of REST. Up until REST was a thing, particularly with Epicor, if you wanted to get data out of Epicor, you had to have flavor of the week interfaces, right? You had Service Connect, right? That was kind of clunky, but it was a way to get data in and out of the system. But it required you to format your data in a specific way, to put it in a specific folder. Somebody had to create a workflow for that data to be consumed by Epicor, and then it would drop back another file or send you an email when everything was done. So that was one way to communicate. You also had the ability to run a BAQ export, for example, to extract some data. You can extract BAQs out of the system. But when you extracted those BAQs, they usually came into a CSV or a comma-separated file. Then you had to find a way to send that file out into wherever its final destination is. And it was never really real time. So that really is what REST gives you, is the ability to communicate with your ERP system from anywhere in any format. As long as you have the ability to make an active connection, you can get that data. Now, like I said, REST only really has those 5 core methods: the get, the put, the post, and the delete. And again, if you're a little lost, I can kind of demonstrate, not the REST stuff yet, but I can kind of demonstrate what I'm talking about, what I was talking about with the browser. So if you open up your browser and you go to Developer Tools here and you look at this Network tab, right? And I go visit google.com, you'll see a whole bunch of stuff happens, right? A whole bunch of stuff happens. But the first thing that happens right up here is that, you see that request method get? So when I typed in google.com, it did exactly what I said. It did a get request to google.com, right? And then the server sent back a response. In this case, the response was a redirect. It sent me somewhere else, right? It sent me over here, but it was a get response. And the same thing happens if you go and clear the, if you go and type in something here and hit Google search. Then if you are fast enough for Google, you can probably find in here that there was a post request. And unfortunately, Google is a lot faster than I am. But trust me, it makes a post request. There it is, right there. So here's a post request. And the post request happens, again, when you write a query and you submit something. You click that button. So that's what I'm talking about when I say HTTP verbs. And you are doing this constantly when you're browsing the web. You don't know you're doing this because your browser is taking care of it. But when you go to a REST interface, you are basically taking charge of making those requests in the right order. So hopefully that kind of clarifies a little bit, what that means. Any questions about what REST is? Okay. All right. So the Epicor implemented REST via another standard called OData. And OData is basically a way to query data out of a REST system by using SQL-like syntax. So most of us who are on the technical side of Epicor, we're used to writing BAQs and writing SQL queries to pull data out of the system. So OData, which is the standard that Epicor chose to settle on, is basically a way to use SQL, quote unquote, to retrieve data out of your system by using REST. And I'll show you that in a second. But basically, you got to think about, that's the reason why they went with this OData standard, right? Unfortunately, there is no standard for REST as a whole that applies everywhere. So what they did is they chose a standard to get on top of. The other nice thing about something like OData is that because it is a well-known standard, it is available to be used out of the box in a million products, including things like Excel. So we'll take a look at that in a second. But basically what it does is it allows you to do selects, filter where clauses, and joins, just like you would in SQL. So when you do, for example, a REST call in Epicor to select something, you can pass in what's a filter, like a where clause. You can also pass in a select, as you can see down here at the bottom. And again, you can say select name, state, and country, and that will return only those 3 or 4 individual fields. That's another benefit of REST. Standard Epicor business objects, when you said something like get me a sales order, it would get you the entire sales order. That means that if you had 100 lines in that sales order and you had 10 miscellaneous charges and 6 sales reps, anytime you said get me that sales order, Epicor would send you the entire sales order back. That means that it's very, very slow and very, very costly performance-wise. When they settled on OData and REST, they gave you the ability to say, hey, I want this sales order information, but I don't want the entire sales order. All I really care about is the total amount on the order and maybe the order number. And that makes the calls in REST much, much more fast than the standard Epicor calls that we know and love from before. So this is a list of a lot of functionality that is built into OData. It has a bunch of built-in functions. Again, I said it basically gives you the ability to use SQL, but within the REST interface. So you can do things like, string to upper, string to lower. You can trim. You can do math. You can do replace. You can do index off, ends with. You can do substrings. You can do a heck of a lot of transformations directly on your REST call. And so that basically takes some of the burden off from the actual application. And it allows you to be very, very dynamic with what you get. So let's take a look real quick at what that looks like. So on any application on any Epicor version above 10.1500, you have REST available natively out of the box, right? And so what that means is that REST is just there. It's available for you to use. Nobody has to turn it on. Nobody has to do anything special to get to it. And to get to that OData page, all you got to do is visit the URL where the REST interface is hosted. And that's always going to be, for me to type in the right stuff, sorry, that's always going to be the name of your server / the name of your Epicor instance, and then API help, right? So if you visit that URL, like mine here, but with your Epicor instance and API help, you should land on the Epicor REST help page. And so this page here is basically a very basic intro on how to use help, or how to use REST, sorry, that Epicor provides. There are 2 versions of REST currently available. There's version 1, which is the standard one that Epicor uses almost everywhere. And then there's version 2, which again It's a newer version. I think it was released in 10.2500 or 10.2300, something like that. And it is a newer version of the REST API. And the reason why they keep both of them around is because they want to be able to give you backwards compatibility, right? So with that said, let's poke around a little bit and kind of see if we understand what I was talking about using SQL equivalents. So if you go into this help page, you get a list of all the different Epicor business objects. So for example, let's look at our customer business object. So if I go in here and I select the Epicor ERP customer service, it's going to generate a help page that's going to show me all the different data points that are available for us to query or retrieve or post or create for an individual customer. So for example, if I wanted to get just a list of customers out of my system, I have this slash customers here. And you can see down here that I have the option to add filters, do things like top or skip. I can do order by, and I can do select. So for example, if I wanted to just get the name of the first 10 customers in my database, I can simply select name for the top 10 customers. And by top 10, I mean the first 10, not any actual top ranking, the first 10 customers in my database. And I can simply hit try it out, and that's going to go out and execute that query in Epicor and return just the name of the first 10 customers in my database. And there it is. So there's Addison and Barrington and Berlin and Mass and Heat and Air. And this data is all returned to you in JSON format. JSON is a very common way of sending data around, particularly in the web. You do have the option with REST to return data back as XML, which is also very, very common approach. But you can kind of see how it sort of looks like SQL, right? So you have select top 10 or select name, and you can have top 10, and you can actually have a filter. So maybe you can filter out, and if you want to select by a particular city or a state, you can do that too. So if I go to state here, state, and I can say EQ for equals to, and I'm hoping that we have some Arizona customers. I don't know, we'll find out. No, we don't. This is the Epicor demo database. So there we go. So we have one New Jersey customer. So it looks a lot like SQL, but really, what does this look like when I'm calling it from the browser, right? This is happening in a little interface that Epicor dynamically generated for us. But if I wanted to use this in, say, an application of some sort, how would this look like? Well, you can kind of look at it down here. When you do a try it out, Epicor shows you the command that they are using to the browser. And it is, again, doing a get, right? If you scroll up here, you can see that it's a get request. So it's doing a get request to this URL and passing in this particular filters at the top. So as a matter of fact, if I copy this and just paste it on the browser, remember that I said when you visit any website on the browser, it makes a GET request. So for GET requests, I can test them directly on the browser. I can simply paste that URL up there, and you can see that I get the response back the same way that I did when I tested it out here, because it's a GET request again, and a GET request automatically gets executed on the browser. So I can change the filter here to maybe New York instead of New Jersey, and I get different data. And so that's basically how REST works. This is what REST is that ability to query data out of your database and into your database very, very easily using a web browser. And when I say a web browser, I mean any device or machine or application that has the ability to do so. Any questions so far?
We do have a couple. How is authentication handled from Peter Blaze?
Yep. So let's take a look at authentication real quick. I think I actually did I cover that later on here? A little bit, not really. All right. So again, I said we have two versions of the API. There's version 1 and version 2. For authentication purposes, you can actually authenticate two different ways with the Epicor Rest API. You can authenticate using a username and password, just your regular Epicor username and password. And you can also authenticate using what's called a token. Epicor has a built-in token service that is a service that allows you to generate tokens. And so what you can do with that is passing a username and password into the token service, and it will actually let you authenticate. So if we go down here to security and custom headers, you can kind of see how it works. So you have basic authentication. The basic authentication, again, is your username and password. And the way that that works is that the username and password are combined into a string separated by a colon and encoded using base 64. That sounds all complicated and fancy, but it isn't, right? Base 64 is just an encoding that removes special characters out of the way, and it makes sure that everything is kind of standardized. So for example, if I wanted to see what my username and password would look like when I send them out to Epicor, you can simply go get yourself a base 64 encoder, which I use all the time, as you can see by my autocomplete here. And it says that it's simply a username and password combined into a string separated by a colon. So you literally would come in here, and in this case, I'm using Epicor : Epicor, right? And I would say encode. And that's what your password looks like when it is sent to Epicor using basic authentication. Now, is this insecure? No, it is not, because the REST interface requires that you have a secure connection, that you have an HTTPS connection. As a matter of fact, I don't know if you noticed earlier, when I first was trying to access the REST interface, it told me that I couldn't because I had forgotten to send in a secure connection. A secure connection means that there's a direct connection between you and the server, the Epicor server. Nobody can look at that transaction. So the fact that your username and password are basically plain text, that is, they're visible to the naked eye, even though it doesn't look like it, you can easily decode this and get your user network and password. It isn't insecure. The other option, like I said, is the token. And again, the way that the token works is Epicor has this service here that allows you to generate a token. So you can simply make a call. Right here. Make a call to this service by passing in your username and password, and it will basically generate a token for you. And a token, again, is just a one-time JWT or JSON Web Token that can be used on every one of your calls to authenticate that you are you. And the beauty about the JSON Web Token is that it actually adheres to one of the canons of REST, and that is the ability for you to be completely stateless. Because remember, REST means representational state transfer. And it means that the server doesn't actually know anything about you or your connection. The server just takes what you give it, processes it, and sends it back. It doesn't keep a log or a tab of who you are, whether you are logged in or not. You actually pass in your username and password or your token to the server in every single call. Now, version 2 gives a little bit more security. It still allows you to authenticate using basic authentication or the token, but they also added what's called an API key. An API key is basically the ability for you to create a very narrow scope of security to give an application permission. So for example, say you were trying to write an application for one of your vendors to get a report out of your system that contains the invoices for that vendor. And you wanted to do this via REST so that they could integrate it directly with their system. Well, you don't want to necessarily create an Epicor username and password for the vendor that gives them access to every other vendor in the system, right? So what you can do is you can actually write a BAQ that returns only the data that that vendor is allowed to use. Then you create an account, an Epicor account, and you give the username and password to that vendor, but you restrict it to only use an API key that allows you to only run that BAQ. So let me kind of walk through that real quick, because that's very, very important, particularly if you're going to open your system up to outside people. So you have this API key maintenance, and again, this is only available with version 2 of REST. But API key maintenance allows you to create a key. So you just come in here, hit new, give it a name. So let's call this vendor report key, vendor RPT. And I'm going to give it vendor report key, only allow to run the one vendor BAQ. And I'm going to hit save. And that generates an API key, right? This is what the API key looks like. And so far, that API key doesn't have any restrictions on it. It's wide open. So anybody who wants to use it can, right? So for example, if I were to copy this and go into my version 2 here and go into let's go into a BAQ. Where my BAQ is at? Well, let's just go to customer, Z customer 01, for example. Oh, actually, that's a BAQ. Let's go to the customer interface here. Again, I'm in V2 now, so it's going to look slightly different, not hugely different, but slightly different. But now I have an API key, and like I said, that API key is wide open. So I should be able to come in here. What company am I in? What company was this? Company 6, Epicor 6. So I can come in here with Epicor 6 and paste my API key and retrieve a list of customers. And you can see that I did get information back because my API is wide open. But I can use this access scope to narrow down the access of my API to allow it to only get very, very specific information. So if I go into my access scope and I create a new access scope, I can actually tell it that I want to narrow it down to one very specific BAQ, for example, or a very specific function of some sort. So I can say vendor narrow and vendor narrow, right? And I can come in here and say, I only want this API key to be able to run a BAQ. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to add a BAQ to my list. And I'm just going to pick a random BAQ in the system. So I'm going to say C customer 01. All right, so this API key is only allowed to run Z customer 01. So I'm going to go ahead and tie my scope to my API key and hit save. Oh. Copy that. My scope. There we go. So now I'm going to tie my API key to my scope. So now I'm going to go back to the screen, and without changing anything, I'm going to hit try it out. Actually, hold on. I got to switch my my actual service because that wasn't actually getting me any data. Let's try that again. So this one here, API key, current company is Epicor 6, and I hit try it out. And it says access is denied. Your system administrator needs to ensure that you have access. And the reason why it did that is because my API key has a narrow scope now. It can only run that one BAQ, the Z customer 01 BAQ. So version 2 is a little more secure. The only problem with that is that version 1 is still available by default on any application. So if you give the vendor a username and password, and you give them an API key that has a narrow scope, it doesn't matter because V1 is still available, and they can simply switch the URL up here from V2 to V1 and bypass the API key. So there are ways to turn off V1 in your system. There are ways to require API keys for V1, but that requires additional configuration and does not work out of the box. All right, any other questions about security on the Epicor Rest interface?
Graham Ross has a question for you. How should our app server be secured when exposing the REST interface to the internet? Should he create a separate app server and put it in a DMZ?
Yeah, there are 1,000 ways to skin that cat. It really has to do more with how secure are your Epicor accounts, how secure is your network as a whole. For example, if you have security, high level of security in your Epicor accounts, that is, your passwords are not dictionary words, they're randomized sentences. You have things like second factor turned on if you're using something like Azure Active Directory. I see no problem with exposing the Epicor REST API directly. I would maybe put it into a DMZ zone, into a different app server. But regardless, you're going to have a connection from that DMZ back into your Epicor server. So I don't know that provides you that much more security. You can also do something like an application proxy. Azure has one. There's a bunch of them out there. You can write your own. But you can basically have a proxy that sits out in the DMZ and that only allows certain requests to come in. But in general, your security has to do a lot more with how is your network set up and how is the security in your system set up, right? If your manager password is still manager, and I know that 191 of you, there's at least 90 of you that the password is still manager, then do not, by any reason, for any reason, put your Epicor API out on the web. But if you've gone through and make sure that your passwords are all secure, that you have things like sign-in timeouts in there so that if somebody tries to log in 3 or 4 times, it locks them out with the wrong password. If you have API keys enabled, I don't see any real reason why you can't expose at least part of your Epicor to the web. But it really is an individual decision, company by company, if you have the skill set in-house to handle that. But as a general rule of thumb, you need to be as secure as possible. So the least amount of access you can give, the better. One of the things that you can do, for example, is expose only the V2 endpoint that requires an API key, right? So you can have the V1 endpoint enabled for internal stuff so that Epicor itself is happy and you can work with things internally. But any requests that come from outside, you can actually block at the router level and say, hey, if it doesn't come to the V2 endpoint, I'm not letting that thing into my network at all. And so that basically removes a huge amount of exposure there, because if V1 is not available, they cannot bypass that API key. As long as you're managing your API keys correctly and only giving them to the people that need to have it, then you have a lot more security there. But it is really an individual decision on company by company basis on how much risk are you willing to tolerate. But there's people out there that are like, oh, never expose your ERP to the internet. That's unrealistic. For a lot of reasons, including the fact that Epicor as a whole runs an entire Epicor ERP cloud in the public cloud on the internet that anybody can hit. And as far as we know, we haven't heard anybody being massively compromised, right? So it can be done. It can be done securely. It just requires that you put a little bit of thought into your security practices, and that you have things like canaries that can monitor strange activity and stuff like that. But it's not really something that I would fear. I mean, we have in our company, we have a customer portal that runs off of the Epicor Rest API, and it is accessible from the web, and we feel okay about it. So it's just a matter of how much risk are you willing to tolerate, and how comfortable are you with your setup, and have really good backups, I guess. How long does this run, Calvin? I can't remember. Is it 2:30 or 3:30?
Yep, I believe it was until 3:30.
All right.
No, 2:30
Or 3
Central Time.
Oh, sorry, I was looking at his.
That's fine. All right, so I went through the service help page. Now, in the later versions of Epicor, 700 plus, the service page changed a little bit from that green stuff that I showed you to the one that I'm showing you here on the left. It works the same way. It's just a little bit more friendly to use. It does a little bit of auto-completing for you. It's a little fancier version, basically. It allows you to do things like add additional headers and things like that. They just upgraded to the next version of Swagger. So if you are in like 700, your help page will look more like the left than the right. And particularly in Kinetic 21, it'll definitely look like the version on the left. We did that already. All right, so I said that one of the benefits of REST is that, and OData in particular, is that it can actually talk to Excel, right? And that's actually kind of neat. So if I go into back into my REST API call here, let me go back to V1 real quick, because it's, what, the reason why I'm going to V1 is because it doesn't require the API key, right? So I'm trying to bypass my own security here. So if I went to go and I run this BAQ customer 01, right? This is a Z customer 01 BAQ, comes built into Epicor, super useful. It's basically a list of all your customers, right? And you can come in here and execute it, say try it out, and it gives you a list of customers. You can take this URL and open up Excel, and as long as your REST API is set up correctly and you have a trusted certificate, that's important. The REST API does need secure connection, so it does need a trusted certificate. You can actually get data directly from the web into your Excel by pasting that URL in there. And Excel supports OData out of the box. Maybe if I hit the right button, there we go. From online services, they changed my version of Excel, so there it is. From OData feed, you see that? So if you click on that, because Epicor supports OData out of the box, you can simply paste that in there and hit OK, and it will ask you for your username and password, and it will basically let you extract that data. See how it says, how do you want to authenticate with Windows basic authentication, right? So I can put in my basic authentication here, because again, Epicor supports basic authentication. and I can hit connect, and it should go out there and allow me to grab data directly from Epicor and bring it into my Excel. And it's asking me, which columns I want to bring, right? I'm just going to say load it all. And now this Excel sheet is actually connecting live to my Epicor application. And when I mean live, I mean live. This is connected to the database. So if I were to add a new customer and I hit refresh here, it's going to fetch a new customer for me. And if I want to do filters in here, it's going to actually pass in the filters to my OData via that OData interface. So the REST API gives you a lot of flexibility right out of the get-go, and you don't have to be a programmer. All you have to know is how to get to that REST help page and grab a couple of URLs, and you can pull data directly into Excel from there. It's read-only, which is a good thing. You don't want your users opening on Excel and changing the address of all the customers. So the OData feed on Excel is read-only, but it does let you basically write a very quick report pretty quickly directly in Excel. From here, you can easily go do things like a pivot, right? You can pivot in your data and then whip up a quick sales forecast report, right? All you need is a BAQ that somebody can write for you, or you can write yourself, drop it into Excel, and throw it into a pivot. So that's one of the great advantages of REST, and it works really well. Any questions about this Excel functionality? The biggest gripe with the Excel functionality, again, is going to be that you need a proper secure certificate. I always have to transform my data when pulling into it. So did you do something different when saying get it from the web? No, so you shouldn't have to transform the data unless you want to, right? The transform the data just lets you rearrange the way it loads, change the number of columns and things like that. But if you just want to get the entire query in there, you just hit go. So you shouldn't have to. Now, if you're returning, 100,000 records, that may get tough, right? It is still Excel. It's still going to take a minute. So, but in general, you shouldn't have to do that. Yes, but the report will be attached. Okay. All right. So that's Excel and REST. So go ahead.
Last question on that, Jose, was: does the security certificate need to be applied to Excel or REST?
So only if you don't have a real certificate. So if you're making your own security certificate, if you're making your own SSL, there really shouldn't be any need for that. You have Let's Encrypt out there in the world now that issues free security certificates to anybody who barely has a pulse. So you should be able to get a real certificate pretty trivially. But if you can't, for some reason, if your network is locked down to the level that you cannot get a real SSL certificate, then Excel will not accept a self-signed certificate unless you teach your computer that that certificate is trusted. All right, and that's going to require a little help from your IT admin of choice. But basically, you just have to install the server SSL certificate as a trusted authority in your machine, and then Excel will accept it. But without that, Excel will bark at it and it will not let you pull any data in. All right, so developer tools. There's a bunch of developer tools you can use to talk to the REST interface. You can use curl, which is basically a free command line tool. There's PowerShell, there's Postman, Fiddler, and then obviously you can write your own code to do it. So Postman is this little guy right here. It's a free available tool that allows you to basically pretend you're a browser, but it gives you a whole bunch of choices. So again, you can just download this online. There's a paid version, there's a free version. The free version works fine with Epicor. But for example, if I wanted to execute, again, that Z customer 01, I can come into Postman, make a new request, tell it is a get. I paste in my token in this case, which is probably going to be expired because it's old. And I hit submit, and then you'll get an error because my token is expired. So I'm going to switch this to basic authentication and try again, and that should work. There you go. So now I get a list of my customers. Again, Postman is an easy way for you to test out the different things that you can do in REST. So if you wanted to turn this into a base, for example, if you wanted to make a new sales order, right? You can do that in Postman in here, and so you can say this one here, it creates a new sales order, right? So this creates a new sales order in the system if you wanted to. You can test the post, the patch, the put, and the delete all with Postman. The other thing that is one of the favorite things of people with Postman is that you can actually get code out of here. So on the right side here, there's this little code button. You can click it, and it will allow you to generate code in almost any language you can think of that will take the request you just made and turn it into usable code right away. So for example, if I wanted to see what this looks like in REST Sharp, I simply select REST Sharp here, and I can copy and paste this code directly into my C# program, and it will run out of the box. And the same thing applies to any of these other ones: Java, C, Node, PHP, Ruby, you name it, it's available. Shell, Swift, if you're doing an iOS thing, Go native, etc. So Postman is a great tool, generates code for you, and that's always very nice. Now, the code it generates is probably not the best or most helpful code, but it does allow you to automatically do things like, for example, if you're going to regenerate that base 64 encoded thing, right? You can do that. It does that for you. So I typed in my username and password here, and it generated that base 64 encoded message for me, so I don't have to do the magic here. All right. So Postman is a great tool. If you are going to be doing a lot of REST, you're going to need to play with it. Fiddler, it's another one that's very, very useful to actually look at the request as it processes. And again, Fiddler is a utility that will sit in your computer, and it will basically listen into any network traffic that is happening on your machine. And so when you're doing REST calls, you can actually see the responses and the requests come in and out. What's this? Oh, so curl, like I said, it's a free utility. I have an example here on how to use curl if you wanted to just run from a command line and get some information out. So you can just literally say curl and then give it the username and password like we talked about with a colon separated, and it will return that information back down to a text file. PowerShell, again, pretty easy to use, has built-in invoke REST method, and you can use it in Epicor too. So here's an example of how to do that in PowerShell. I'll email this PowerPoint slide to Calvin and Fred, and they can make it available to you if you wanted to. I talked about Postman, and I talked briefly about Fiddler. In terms of writing your own codes, there's a bunch of library available. Some of them other folks have written. Ed Walsh have written them. I've written a few of them myself. There's REST Sharp, which is a commonly available library for making REST calls in C#. There's a package for Node and a package for Angular, and there's a bunch of example codes in Brian Connor's Epicor's Brian Connor's GitHub, and my GitHub also has some examples on how to do that. So we have like 15 minutes left. So I wanted to, actually drop down to the nitty-gritty here and try to write a quick application using REST, because that's one of the beautiful things about REST is how quick it is to develop something if you're writing custom code. And a lot of you may not be coders, and that's okay. But that's one of the great benefits of REST is the fact that you can actually write very quickly an application and get data live into your application. So in this case, I'm going to simply just drag in here a simple grid, if I can find it. I don't want an ultra grid. What the heck, let's use an ultra grid. All right, so a simple grid into my application. And all I want to do is basically be able to run a BAQ in Epicor and get that data into my application. So all I did is I just opened Visual Studio and started up a brand new project, right? And this is just going to be a Windows form project with a grid at the bottom, and maybe I want a text box at the top here. And this text box is going to be the name of my BAQ that I want to run. And again, this is going to be a very, very trivial example of what you can do, but it'll hopefully give you an idea of how easy it is to write a custom application here using REST. So I'm going to call this retrieve. All right, so I have my little application. So if I run it right now, it doesn't do anything, right? It's got a button on it, and it's got a text box, and it's got an empty grid. But what I want to do is I want to be able to run a BAQ through it. So I have my application here, right? It doesn't do anything. I can hit this button to my heart's content. Nothing happens, right? So let's talk about how we do this. Remember I said that Postman allows you to copy and paste some code, right? And it will run that code for you, right? So that's one option, right? So I'm doing, if I want to just run zcustomer01, Postman will let me copy paste this code into my C#, and that will do it for me. And I also said that there are some libraries available. So I'm going to use a library just because it's a little easier. So I'm going to go in here to NuGet and search for Epicor Rest. And there's a library available, and I can just install that and use it. And again, the beauty of using a library is that you don't have to deal with all the nitty-gritty, like converting your username and password into a base 64 encoded string. All right, so I just simply installed my library here, and now it is available for me to use. So all I want to do is when I click this button, I want to take the value that was typed into this text box, and I want to run that BAQ. All right, as simple as that. And I'm going to do it using that library. So the first thing I do is I have to initialize my library. So I'm going to go here and add a using statement so that I can do this a little easier. And so now I have Epicor Rest, and I have V1 and V2. I'm going to be using V2 just because I like V2 a little bit better. It asks me for the host, that is the URL of my Epicor server. And so I'm going to type that in here, az-epicor-apple1.stephengould.com. And it asks me for the instance. I'm using the demo database, so it's just called Epicor demo. Type a little fast, eh? All right, and then the next thing I gotta do is just give my username and password. So I'm gonna hard code this in. Obviously, you can bring this in from a configuration file, or you can have the user type them in. If you're doing an end user application, you can have the user type them in. So that's pretty good. I'm gonna tell it what company I wanna use by default. It was, I believe I was in Epicor 6, right? Yeah. And because I'm using version 2, I need to give it an API key. So remember, we had an API key that we had used before, and I believe I actually told it that my API key could only use, could only run the zcustomer01 query, right? That's what we had told it. So I'm actually going to make a new one because I lost my old API key. Oh, that's the other thing to keep in mind. Your API keys, once you generate them, if you don't write them down real quick, you lose them. Once they're generated, you see here, once I copy paste this, when I come back to this API key again, if I clear out of here and I come back, it is not visible. It is gone, and you cannot retrieve it. You cannot get it back. So do keep in mind that information. Epicor does tell you that, and I'm really bad at it. I always lose my API keys, and then I have to go make them again, right? And I just did the same thing. I just made a boo-boo. I forgot to copy it before it showed it to me blocked. So let's do this and save it. And again, the reason for that is because API keys work via what's called a one-way hash. So once the API key is generated, Epicor actually doesn't even know what the API key is. All they know is the end of it. All right, so now I have set up my REST API with all the information I need to be able to execute code in Epicor. I have given it the username, or the URL, the application instance, my username, my password, the company I want to use, and the API key. Obviously, all of this can be done dynamically, but I don't have time to go into all that. So I'm just hard coding this information. But the one thing I do want to get is get the BAQ name from this text box here. So I'm going to create a variable, and I'm going to call it BAQID, and I'm going to pull it from my text box one.text. All right, so now I am actually getting my BAQ name from that text box, and all I want to do is I want to run the BAQ and put the result into my grid here, right? And so I can do that pretty easily by using, again, the REST API. I can say BAQ, and you can see here that it supports BAQ get and BAQ patch. BAQ patch is because BAQs are updatable, and BAQ get just lets you retrieve some data. There's also BAQ get data table, and what that means is that you can actually get the information out of the system in a data table format, which will be a lot easier for me to use in my grid. It wants the BAQ ID as a parameter, which I have already extracted, and then it wants me to do pass in some additional filters and things like that, but I don't really have a need for that. So I'm going to say var data equals to that. And I'm going to simply assign the result of that to my ultra grid 1 here. So I'm going to say ultra grid 1 dot data source equals to data and ultra grid data bind. And just like that, assuming I typed everything correctly and set up my application the right way, I should be able to run my application, run a BAQ in Epicor, retrieve the information, and run it in my grid. So now all I gotta do is come here, type in my BAQ ID, and hit retrieve. And so far, I just wanna make sure that it doesn't explode on me. Looks like it's fine. And there you go. So now we have an application with just a couple lines of code. We have an application that can retrieve all list of customers from Epicor, and I didn't have to do any magic. And I believe that's literally like the end of the thing. But if you have any questions, comments, concerns, if you want to talk about a project you're working on or whatever, I am definitely available. But hopefully that kind of gave you a glimpse into what the REST API is all about, how you can use it to your advantage, and if you wanted to, how you can write custom applications that talk directly to Epicor. And we use, like I said, we use this extensively in our organization for integration purposes. We have EDI, quote unquote, where vendors send us stuff and we need to generate POs, and we do all of that through the REST interface.
So now Heather Hahn has a question for you. Were you born knowing that it needed the app pool host, the app pool instance? How did you know what variables to pick for your button click?
Yeah. So there's documentation on the library, right? So I already know this because A, I wrote the library, and B, I have read documentation. But there is documentation available for all those libraries. So in the PowerPoint, I provide links to some of these libraries. So if you click on the library, it'll bring you over to the site that has all the information, including the different documentation about it. So you can see here that there it is, the app pools and an app pool instance and the username and the password and the API key. So it's all documented in most libraries, not just this one, but any library that you use should have some sort of documentation available to you. So yes, that's how I knew what to do, but it's because it's well documented. So if you wanted to see how do you call a BAQ, right? BAQ get is the customer one. That's exactly what we did, right? So the documentation provides you all the information you need to know, hopefully, if the documentation was written correctly. Anything else?
David Height has a question here. Is there some example code where an update or parameters exist in a test one? You can offer us or anything?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I didn't.
Is there some example code where an update or parameters exist?
Gotcha. So parameters are actually in this API. Again, the parameters are in different, depends on what you're doing. But in a BAQ, in an updatable BAQ or a UBAC, a parameter is just passed in like any additional filter. So for example, if I wanted to just get the top 10 customers, right, this is actually considered a parameter. So if instead of getting an entire list of customers like I am here, I can actually pass in a parameter, which is going to be that top string. There we go. So I can create basically a list of parameters that are going to be passed in. So in this case, I'm going to pass in that quote unquote parameter of top, and I'm going to tell it I only want the top 10 customers. But any other parameters, like if you had a BAQ with actual parameters, they would be passed the exact same way. So just like I said, I create a dictionary here, and I'm passing in my parameter and then the value. If you had a parameter that was like customer ID, for example, you would just simply do cost, you would do this, and you would say cost ID, and you would pass in the value, right? Now, this particular BAQ, the Z customer 01, doesn't have any parameters, but like I said, this top or the filter is actually a parameter. They work exactly the same as any parameter would. So then all you do is you pass in that list of parameters into your call here as the second option. So you can see that the options are the BAQ ID, and then right after that, you have the parameters dictionary. So now if I run this same exact code, again, the only thing I'm saying is give me only the top 10 customers. This should run the same way that it did before, but it should give me back only 10 customers, right? And there you go. So it only gave me 10 customers. So that's how you would pass in a parameter, particularly on a BAQ. Again, each API is a little different. So if you're not doing BAQs, if you're doing, customer get by ID, Again, some of those have parameters too, but it all depends on how the actual API expects it. So here's ABC code, for example. And if I wanted to get a specific ABC code, right? Looks like in this case, it's passed in as two parameters, right? So you pass in the company and the ABC code as independent parameters. If you were going to do something fancier, like a custom code, like you're doing like a get by ID, well, you got to pass in a dynamic parameter in that case. So you got to pass in a parameter that looks like this. And that requires you to write a custom JSON string that's passed in as part of the parameters. So it depends on every API, but the documentation for this library and all the other libraries that I recommend do cover how to do that. And for an update, again, you would just simply change the data, right? In this case, we got a list of customers. If this was an updatable BAQ, you would change the data, and then you would make a call to the Epicor Rest .BAQ patch. And again, if you look at the parameters here, you pass in the BAQ ID and you pass in the data you changed. And again, that will execute the patch for that particular BAQ. But again, the BAQ has to be updatable.
Okay, Carl Fredrickson is asking a question. What data structure does the BAQ get return versus the BAQ get data table?
Good question. So the BAQ get, let me leave this in here. And again, this is very specific to this library, but the BAQ get data table returns a data table, which is a standard C# object. If you just did a regular BAQ get, and we can definitely do that, right? And you can change this to BAQ get. What you get back is you get a dynamic object, and I can put a break on there and show you. This dynamic object contains the actual JSON information that was sent back, as well as a dynamically generated object that lets you do quite a few more quote unquote fancy things. But so I'm going to step through the code here very briefly and hover over this. What did I do here? Data. There we go. It returned an Epicor response object, right? And that contains the response body. So this is actually a JSON. Look at that. You can see the JSON values, right? And you can use this as a regular JSON string to do whatever you want with it. So you can serialize it. You can do whatever it is. Some APIs out there, like if you're using Alexa, for example, if you're using the Amazon Alexa device, it will actually take the JSON and do whatever you ask it to do. So JSON is a very common way to communicate with APIs. So that's why it returns JSON, but it also returns a dynamic object. And when I mean a dynamic object is it basically turns your response into a class. This is response data here, and it allows you to address it by name. So I can do things like in my code, I could say data.datax that Epicor, that response data dot, and based on that format that the response has, let me see, yeah, well, I don't have the customer one up. No, I don't. But if I look at that JSON object again, let's look at the JSON object again. Come on. So I can see that it's got the response body. It's got a value, and that value is an array. And the first item under is customer underscore company. So technically, in my dynamic object, I should be able to address that particular field by name directly. And again, a dynamic object is kind of an advanced C# concept, but basically allows you to access objects dynamically by name. So I could say here, I could simply in my code, I could simply say data x dot response data, which is my dynamic object, and then I know it has a dot value. I know value is an array, and I know the first item is called customer underscore company, and so I should be able to get specifically that value by name as if I had a class available to me. So I can also get the customer custody, right? I think it's custody, yeah, right. And so that is a dynamic object. That's what you get from the BAQ get. You get both the JSON data as well as a dynamic object. If you do a BAQ get data table, you get a standard C# data table with rows and columns that you can display or easily attach to a grid.
Okay, Heather Hahn is asking, how do you deploy the form that you just created so that it can be accessed by a user? This is just
So,
a C# program, isn't it?
right. This is just an application on your computer, or my computer in this case, right? It's just a simple application. So when you're, if I can open, I can show you, it'll just be an exe, right? Just like you can open epicor.exe or word.exe. At the end, you actually get a rest test.exe, and you can just package this up into a zip file and deploy it to the people's computers however you want, and they can just double click on it, and the application will just run right there. So this is an actual custom application. It is not embedded in Epicor. It is a completely isolated application, and I use it for a lot of things. I have, for example, we need to DMT PCIDs into Epicor a lot, and the DMT doesn't actually support PCID DMTs with quantity. So we wrote a REST-driven PCID DMT process that allows me to load PCIDs into Epicor, and it works exactly like this. You open up the application, you give it the file you want to import, the DMT file you want to import, and it does the work for you. So here's my PCID DMT, which I was just using earlier today. So, and it works exactly like that. So I can just give this application, and I have, to a lot of the folks in my company, and they just, when they want to load PCIDs, they just run it, right? It's called DMT PCID. There's Epicor settings. Remember how I told you that your Epicor settings could be dynamic? So they have a way here to change applications and things like that. And then they pick a file that they want to DMT. So here's a PCID. Let's see what I have in here. Yeah, PCID DMT, and there's the PCIDs that they wanted to load earlier. And I can hit process, and it will load them up into Epicor with the right quantities and all that stuff. And all I did again was use the REST API to mimic a trace that I did on the PCID build split merge, and I just wrote this application. And so I just give this exe, deployed it to them via via GPO, and then it's available in their computers for those people in the warehouse who need to sometimes DMT PCIDs.
So if Heather wanted to put this on her menu somewhere, she could use one of the UD forms, add a text box to it, add the code to it, add the grid to it, and there you go, Heather. Now you have a quick way to deploy information inside using the Epicor framework.
Right.
Anything special to have Excel use the V2 of the REST?
Because of the V2 of the REST uses API keys, it is a little bit gnarly. I think there are some instructions on how to do that in Epi users. I don't know out of the top of my head what the setup looks like. I know it can do it, but it basically requires you to pass in the API key as part of the URL because Excel does not support API keys out of the box.
Another question here from Dan Sorrell. Where do we find the Epicor library?
Well, the library is available in depending on the environment that you're using. So if you're using something like Node or Angular, that would be available in the NPM, the Node Package Manager tool. If you're using Visual Studio, it's available as what's called a NuGet packet. So you can just go into Visual Studio and search for it in your NuGets. And again, you search for Epicor Rest, and it should come right up there. There's a few versions, some for mobile development. There's some other things. Again, these are not Epicor libraries made by Epicor. A lot of these are made by other people, but they work well. There's also a bunch of entries about this on Epi users about how to use the libraries and things like that. So hopefully that's another option there.
Awesome. Tim's got a question here. Out of the box, emails can be logged to CRM using Information Worker on a laptop. Via REST, is it possible to log emails sent from a phone?
Yes. Anything is possible. Now, it's not trivial, but anything is possible. So actually, you can do this pretty trivially with an iPhone. So iPhone has an application called Siri Shortcuts. And Siri Shortcuts is basically a mini Service Connect, if you could think of it that way. And one of the things it has in there is it has a bunch of triggers. So there probably, I don't have my phone in front of me, but there might be a trigger in there that says when an email arrives, right? That could be a trigger. And then action would be make a post or a patch, in this case, to this UBAC that says, hey, an email arrived from person XYZ. So yeah, you could definitely do that with REST. And that's, I mean, information worker, I don't think has been updated recently for REST, but that is the way that most information worker type systems work. As a matter of fact, I know that a couple of people who basically wrote their own information worker type service to hook up into Outlook to do the same thing, and it does use REST.
Awesome. Shahan just wrote, we have upgraded to 700 recently, so REST help interface has changed. Is there any way to get back to the previous REST help interface?
Yeah, so, well, if you're at 700, I think on the top right, hold on, I got it right here. Let me open up my dev instance. So if you're in the newer version, there is a, where's my, there's on the top right, there's a button you can click. I'm trying to remember what the syntax for it is. Here we go. So here's my REST help, the new one, right? This is what he's talking about. So this is the new one. And if you don't like this one, there is this, go to old help page right here. See that?
Got it.
Click that and it'll take you to this one, and this one is the old and trusty green one. It's still a little bit different, but it's the same style. It just has different colors, but it's the same way that it used to work. It's just not green anymore.
Awesome. And Bruce Larson sent out, what could be done with data collection and REST to replace MES? A whole lot.
Yeah, everything you want. Everything you want.
Okay, we've reached our time to go to Stump the Chump here.
Yep.
I'm going to throw one other question to Jose here. Have you run into any REST services that don't function yet as requested?
So most, actually, I would say all the REST services function the way that their standard Epicor business objects function. The one issue you might run into is that OData thing I talked about earlier. So OData is a very specific and special framework for REST. So when you visit the REST help page, you will, by default, usually get the OData list, right? And this OData list here will work for, I would say, 95 to 96% of the business objects in Epicor. But some business objects are so complex that they cannot just be used with get, post, delete, and patch very simply like it can with ABC code. In that case, you need to switch to what's called a custom method. And that's done over here on the top right. And that switches you over to the old style Epicor business objects where you have your get by ID, your delete by ID, your get rows, and all that stuff. And in this interface, as far as I know, every single Epicor business object will work exactly the same as it did before. So sometimes you'll have to get out of this OData list and go into the custom method list if your business object is sufficiently complex. And by that, I mean, if you're talking about, bill of materials, job entry stuff, some of that stuff where you're trying to actually create a bill of materials or create a detail for a job, that will not be easily accomplished in OData because OData kind of flattens out the data structure. And for example, a job has something like 15 different tables that you can write to. And that's a lot easier to do using the custom methods. But yeah, if you switch to the custom methods, I would say you should have 100% compatibility across the board with all business objects. There may be some idiosyncrasies about them, but that's baked into the original business object and nothing REST specific.
Awesome. And Tim Shoemaker, do you want to go ahead and unmute? I'm going to have you go ahead and share that post that you ended up throwing out here. You have yourself muted.
There we go.
Awesome.
Hold on a second. Let me switch over to my headphones. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So what I was just sharing is that one area we used REST in, and I'm kind of oversimplified what we did because we did it before we had Epicor functions available, but basically we created a Epicor function type thing that we called through REST. And when we called it, we created a very simple sales order header, sales order detail, because the third-party application we had outside on the website we didn't want them to have access to everything, all business objects, because we didn't want them to be able to just create orders and say, create and update sales orders. So we basically gave them access to one business object, which was our function. That function, you had limited amount of stuff you could put in. So you put in the sales order header information like the customer ID, and I think we allowed order date and required date for the whole header. And then we had order details, and it was very, very simple what we, part number and quantity and date. And basically our function read this information from the JSON, went and validated it and said, hey, does that customer exist? Are they on credit hold? All that kind of stuff. If there wasn't a problem, we'd send back a message saying, no, they're on credit hold. If the part doesn't exist, it would throw back the whole order, but it would validate it. And if it was all good, it would create a sales order and pass back a sales order number. So it was a very simple, we created our own REST call basically by creating an Epicor function. So.
Awesome. So pretty much sky's the limit with REST.
Yep.
Or can you get into orbit?
The idea was we wanted to make it simple. And if you think about creating a sales order, there's a ton of fields you have to populate before you can call one of those sales order post processes. Well, we didn't want to have the third-party app have to know all of that garbage. We wanted them to know hey, what's the minimum you need to have? You need a customer ID and and a PO number, and so we made it so that it was very, very simple. We gave them a very simple, straightforward JSON format of what they needed and just the minimal amount. And we took care of all the rest in our function so that we made sure that things were validated right. So anyway, that was my idea.
Awesome. And Heather's like, hey, Tim, can you go ahead and demo that sometime?
Sorry, I don't have it actually. It was done at a customer site a year and a half ago. So I don't even have, I think I do have the code, but I would do it differently now than I would have done it then because we didn't have functions, like I said. So we did it kind of in an under the table function, but it was what I'm describing. We did use REST to call our function. So.